The paper that received the Outstanding Article Award is titled Weeding Out Flawed Versions of Shareholder Primacy. Now, the subtitle is a reflection on the moral obligations that carry over from principals to managers. Now, the key insight is that managing in the interest of shareholders entails not only trying to promote the interests of shareholders, but also having to fulfill certain obligations on their behalf. Now, which obligations? Obligations that in general bind all shareholders. You might think that all obligations are like that, but actually not all of them are like that. There are some obligations, so for instance, helping someone in need, charity, is an obligation that allows for a lot of leeway. We all have to help others in need, but when exactly we're supposed to do it, whom we're supposed to help, how we're supposed to help them is pretty open. And it is always legitimate to sort of like pass on an opportunity to help without that meaning that you're not abiding by the duty. Compare that to, for instance, the duty not to lie or the obligation not to kill an innocent person. Those obligations bind everyone without exception. And as such, they don't allow for any kind of leeway in the way that, for instance, charity allows. So the key insight in the paper is that shareholder primacy requires managers to fulfill the non-elective obligations, but they're not necessarily required to fulfill obligations that allow for the leeway that I discussed. What that entails is that shareholder primacy is much more demanding, ethically speaking, than it has typically been acknowledged. But recognizing that is still compatible with recognizing that still there are certain responsibilities that managers should not fulfill on behalf of shareholders, but that shareholders should fulfill directly. So for instance, charity. Now, the importance for business practice is that I'm providing managers with a family of distinctions that will help them understand which obligations they're required to fulfill on behalf of shareholders and which were not. Of course, that means that they should try to incorporate into their decision-making practices this dimension of their managerial role. Now, for business theory, the contribution of my paper is trying to propose a different way of engaging with a particular problem that people in business ethics have identified. Namely, shareholder primacy, as it's typically interpreted by business practitioners, economists, and lawyers, is a pretty crappy ethical theory. It's pretty weak, ethically speaking. And as we all have seen, it hasn't led to the kind of promotion of the common good that we should expect from it. Now, most business scholars have attempted to respond to that by proposing an entirely different model of how companies should be managed. Namely, they should be managed in the interest of all stakeholders. Managers should be trying to create value for all of them and to balance their interest. I think that's an interesting and promising model, but I think we should also, within the field, try to explore if we can have a different version of shareholder primacy that is much more robust, ethically speaking. And that's what I've been trying to do. I'm providing what you could call an internal critique, where I ask, okay, let's assume that managers ought to fulfill or ought to serve the interests of shareholders. And let's think carefully through that commitment. Let's think what that entails. And when you think about it, surprise, surprise, you realize that the obligations of managers are actually much more demanding than it was acknowledged. And as such, what I'm trying to contribute is showing that the traditional criticisms that business ethicists have provided to shareholder primacy are criticisms that, while legitimate to a business practice that we have nowadays, are not the best criticism of our moral theory we could have. Namely, there's better versions of shareholder primacy out there. And we should try to sort of like understand what those are. And only when we have clear on those in view, we can sort of like compare whether that version of shareholder primacy is better or more attractive than stakeholder primacy, or in which situations is one or the other model more attractive. I hope this has led you to become more interested in reading the paper. There's actually two parts of the project. The first is the paper that was awarded the prize, but there's a second part of it that was published also in Business Ethics Quarterly in 2020. If you read the papers, please reach out with any questions or comments, or simply just to sort of like let me know what you thought about the paper.